Hello everyone, and welcome back to Part 6, Form Selections. In this lecture, we're going to continue exploring the variety of input methods for HTML forms. And those are going to be things such as a single radio button, how to link multiple radio buttons, drop-down menus, and then text area inputs. Coming up next after this lecture will be an assessment exercise, so we can fully understand everything that has to do with HTML forms. And that will end our HTML sections of the course. But before we reach the next assessment, let's get some quick practice with these various input methods. Alright, so here I have a normal HTML file open and it's linked to my browser. It's just called forms.html, and you can see here I've set the title to Hotel Feedback. So we now know enough HTML that we can try to mimic more of a real-world situation. For instance, let's say you've stayed in a hotel. Afterwards, they may send you an email to a link asking for some feedback. So we're going to try to mimic what that feedback page would look like. And to do this, let's just start with a heading that says something like Hotel Feedback Form. Save this, refresh over here. Looks like it's linked correctly. Great. Now let's start with our form. And if you just auto create form, it'll have class, action, method, etc. Right now we don't really need that. If you want, you can set method to just be get right now. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be covering what get and post is much more in the future. Right now you can just leave it as you see it here. First thing I want to do is understand how radio buttons work. So for instance, if you just type in input and in type instead of text, you pass in radio, you can save this, refresh, and you see a little radio button pop up here. And if I click it, I can see that it got filled in. But right now if I try to click it again, nothing changes. I can't click it on and off. It's just clicking once. So let's try to expand on this concept by actually asking a question here. So in a header or heading 3, I'm going to say this. Are you from inside the US or outside the US? So maybe we have international travelers and we want to know, do they come from the United States or outside the United States if this hotel is in the United States or somewhere internationally. And then we'll have an input as a radio button, and we will label this radio button. And let's review how we can label using that for method. So I can say something like for in US, and then give this particular radio button an ID of let's say in USA. So let's save that. And in this label, I'm going to say something like inside. Save it, refresh, and here we see, are you from inside the US or outside the US? And right now I can just highlight the only option available, inside, and I can only highlight it on, I can't change anything about it. So let's make another one. We'll make another label. We'll call this for out USA, and we will call this outside. And then create another input. We'll make another radio button type and give it the ID to match that label, which in our case is out USA. We will save this, refresh, and now we see we have a hotel feedback form and we have two options, inside or outside. But right now we have a little bit of a problem. I can actually highlight inside, highlight outside, and that's it. That's all I can do right now. What I would really like to do is to link these two radio buttons together so that if I click inside, then outside cannot be selected. Or if I click outside, then inside cannot be selected. So I want to be able to turn these on and off in respect to each other. And the way you do that is you give them the same name. And that's where this name comes into play. So let's give this first radio button a name, LOC, for location. And let's give the second one the same name, LOC. Now let's save this. Refresh, and we notice if I click inside, it's highlighted. If I click outside, inside becomes unhighlighted. So we can see now that they're linked because they share the same name. And that makes sense because given what we know about names and the assignment, we'll have to assign something to that name. And in this case, we can only assign one of these two. So it'll either be inside or outside. And that's how you link radio buttons together. You just give them the same name. They can have different labels, but if you want to link them together, you just give them the same name. All right, let's start exploring another type of input here. And this one is going to be, let's say, we'll ask, how was your service? So how was your service. Save that, make sure it worked. All right, so how was your service? And let's actually make this header 2 instead of just a paragraph, so it kind of matches along with the other one. And let's make this other one header 2 so it's not so big. So we'll say header 2 over here as well, h2. Save that, refresh over here. So are you from inside the US, outside? That's linked together. How was your service? For this service, what we're going to do is explore a drop-down menu. And the way a drop-down menu works is not with the input tag, but with the select tag. And the select tag works like this. You say select. You can give it a class. Right now, that doesn't make sense for us because we haven't learned about CSS, so we'll come back to that later. And we can give it a name. So let's give this the name stars. So we want a drop-down menu of how many stars. And what we can do is give an option. And then this option has a value. So let's give this a value of great. And in between these option tags is going to be an actual number. So we'll say 3. Let's save this and see what this looks like so far. So here we have the drop-down 3. And so far, that's it. So let's create a couple more options for this drop-down menu, and then we can break down what value is. So I'm going to make another value that just says OK. That's 2. And then let's make one more option. And we will say this is bad, and it was 1 star. So now if I save this, I have my select, which indicates a drop-down menu. I've given a name to my select, and I have various options here. With what happens in between the option tags is what's actually displayed to the user. But behind the scenes, they can have their own values. So let's refresh this. And now that we say, how is your service? I see this drop-down gives me 3, 2, or 1 that I can choose from. So let's add a submit button to this so we can see what happens when I hit submit. So outside of this, but inside the form, I'm going to create a submit button and give it a value called submit. Save that and refresh. And now let's pay attention to what happens to the URL after I hit submit. I'll say I'm from inside the US and my service was 2. So now that I've clicked submit, we see here in the URL that I have LOC is equal to, and right now it's actually blank, and then it says and stars is equal to OK. So what I want to do is back in these radio buttons, actually fill in a value here that corresponds to the radio button. So I will set the value for inside, for the inside radio button, and set the value here for outside. Let's save this and refresh. And let's actually delete these values here. Go back to the forms page, refresh this, and now let's try again. We'll say hotel feedback form. Are you from inside? We'll say we're from inside. How was the service? We'll give it 1 star. And notice here, now I have corresponding values in both the drop-down menu and the radio buttons. So if I click submit, now I can see here in the URL that my LOC, the name, is equal to the value inside, since I chose inside. And stars is equal to the value here, bad. And that's a really nice way that you can have your own value names on your back end, but show something else on the front end. So notice that the front end here, especially for the drop-down menu, was 3, 2, 1, but on the back end, I had these set values, great, okay, bad. What might be more realistic is if you actually set values on to numerical values, 3, 2, 1, and then here the options are great, okay, bad. And then you can maybe take mathematical averages behind the scenes. But we're going to learn a lot more about back-end stuff later on in this course. But hopefully you get an idea now of what's possible. Finally, I want to add one more type of input that we want to check out, and that's the text area input. So I'm going to put a paragraph here, and we'll have a question that says something like, any other feedback you want to give as a paragraph? Well, let's actually make that a header 2. That way it's the same size as everything else. And we so far have learned about the text input. In fact, it's the default. So if I click save here, refresh, I see any other feedback. But usually you don't want the user to just type everything in one single line. You want an actual box text area. So the way we can do that is instead of text, we can say text area. And that actually creates its own text area tag. So I will delete this and say text area. We can give that a name. So we can just use the default here, or we can say my text, and you give it a number of rows and a number of columns you want it to expand. So let's save this and now refresh and see here. Now I have my text area. So hello, this is my text area, and now we have multiple lines that we can start typing stuff in. And we're going to learn more about text areas right now because it's a little different than taking in a single value because you have whole blocks of text. But I just want you to be aware that you have a text area here at your disposal. All right, so that's it for the various types of inputs we wanted to cover here under form selections. Let's do a quick review. Let me expand this. We've covered how to do radio buttons. Remember, that's just input and the type is radio. And if you want to link radio buttons together, you make sure the group of radio buttons just has the same name. And you can assign values to them so that once you click submit, you can get those values back. Then for a drop-down menu, you use the select tag with options. And you can then again assign values, and the values don't have to match up what the user actually sees as their drop-down options. And then finally, we learned about the text area, which allows you to basically make a block for a text area. And if we come back here to the browser, we can see that we can actually kind of play around with this a little bit as far as how far down it can go. And then finally, we have the submit button that we've covered before. All right, coming up next is an assessment exercise so you can get a lot of practice with everything we've covered in this section of the course. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.